Day 5, the Holy Land Pilgrimage. We began the morning very early on the Jordan River, renewing our baptismal vows. Up off the Jordan River is the Sea of Galilee. It's behind me. You're going to see it at another spot later today. But today we're gathered in Capernaum. Capernaum is the town where Jesus moved after he was summarily booted from Nazareth. Capernaum is about 25 miles from Nazareth. He walked along the lowlands and through a cliff, opening in a cliff rock, and into the Sea of Galilee and settled here. We know early on that Jesus called two sets of brothers, right? Andrew and Peter and James and John, the sons of Zebedee. These guys lived in Capernaum. Jesus essentially moved into Peter's house. What you see behind me are the ruins of Peter's house, where Jesus lived and where Jesus did so much of his ministry, so much of his early healing. And in fact, the first of his healing is to raise up Peter's mother-in-law who is sick with fever. In this neighborhood, Peter is a very powerful force because you get a real sense of Peter and James and John and Andrew as being fishermen. This ruin behind me was not only Peter's house, but over time when they were excavating, they found on the walls written, Peter and Jesus, Peter and Jesus. So one of the early house churches, if not the earliest house church, is right here behind me, and it is the house of Peter. Our Maranatha house churches back at St. Mark's get part of their idea from the early church. They didn't have churches, they had houses, and Peter's house became a sacred house in early church. Here we are right next to where Peter's house is. What you see behind me is the way that the houses were organized. You'll see a lot of little squares, and those squares are simply the rooms of the houses. And when they had another child or another child got married, they just built another room. If they needed another room, they just built it next to it. Oftentimes we hear these stories about Jesus being in a space and it's not big enough, and they're all waiting outside the door, spilling all over the place. Well, you can see that the rooms were not very big. And one of the issues with the rooms, of course, is that they had the stone sides, but then they would get wood to lie across the top and then put the mud on top of it. And that's where you get that great story of Jesus healing the paralytic man when they came in and pulled the mud apart and pulled the branches of the trees apart and lowered the paralytic down. So the paralytic was lowered into a room about this size when Jesus said to him, get up and walk and your sins are forgiven, causing a great stir that we're still talking about today.